In any military conflict, mistakes happen. It happened in 2021 when the US launched a Hellfire missile at an ISIS terrorist, except he wasn't a terrorist. He was an aid worker. 2 months ago, Israel's army, the IDF, accidentally hit Egyptian border guards with tank fire. But this latest story feels different.
A stunning admission from the Israeli military.
3 hostages were killed by Israeli fire
after mistakenly being identified as Hamas fighters.
It feels different because this wasn't a drone strike from the clouds. It wasn't an errant tank shell. This wasn't botched intelligence. It was, according to the IDF, a soldier shooting at 3 unarmed, shirtless hostages waving a white flag. So, how does that happen? Let's start by being unequivocally clear. The IDF says a soldier screwed up. That was in an interview with DW News and many other media outlets since the incident.
It was contrary to the rules of engagement. It shouldn't have happened, and it was a mistake by the soldier who fired.
The way the IDF tells it, and how I've seen it reported in the media, 3 Israeli hostages had somehow managed to escape their Hamas captors in Gaza. They were exiting a building, approaching Israeli soldiers for help, reportedly several dozens of meters away. Importantly, they were waving some kind of makeshift white flag, and they had their shirts off.
Authorities now saying the men called out for help in Hebrew as IDF forces approached. 3 people came out, this Israeli Major General says. They took off their shirts so that no one would think they have an explosive device and held a white cloth on a pole to identify themselves.
According to the IDF's investigation, the soldier who fired on them thought this was a Hamas trick, a way of luring soldiers into a trap. He reportedly shouted "terrorists" and killed 2 of the hostages. The 3rd was wounded, retreating back into the building he came from. He cried for help. In Hebrew, the commander in charge called for everyone to stop shooting. But when that wounded hostage came back out, a different soldier shot him and he died. The soldiers acted during combat and under pressure, according to the chief of the Israeli army.
It broke my heart, broke the entire nation's heart, and our hearts go to the families at this tough hour.
Now, I'll admit, I had a hard time understanding how something like this was possible. Like, how do you see 3 people surrendering and mistake them for the enemy?
At one level, it's not that surprising. In any combat situation, there is a lot of confusion, and the handover of prisoners and the acceptance of white flags actually is a common moment when errors are made.
Let's start by examining one very specific claim from the IDF, that the soldier who fired really did think his unit was under threat.
There are threats 360 degrees all around, up, down, in every direction. And remember that Hamas fighters have re-infiltrated and attacked Israeli troops from behind. So the sense of threat, fear, dread will be intense in this urban environment. It's a very confusing, very complicated environment.
That's Anthony King. He's a professor of war studies in the UK. And what he just said makes a lot of sense. You know, the famous phrase from the American Civil War is, "War is hell."
So those soldiers have been fighting now door to door, house to house for 10 plus weeks. They are frazzled, they are sleep deprived, they're on sensory overload, and they would presume anything and everyone is a threat.
So I don't know whether I can't put myself into the mind of the soldier that shot them. I wasn't there, but I would presume that he was overcome by fear.
Again, not hard to imagine, but even war has rules.
A incomplete violation of the rules of engagement.
Usually when we talk about the rules of engagement in this kind of a scenario, the convention is pretty clear. From an Israeli military manual, it is absolutely forbidden in the strongest terms to attack such a combatant, referring to one who has surrendered. There is no moral justification in attacking him, nor is there any military necessity to do so. And the head of Israel's army felt the need to remind his soldiers of this after those 3 Israeli hostages were shot dead.
ואם זה שני עזתים עם דגל לבן שיוצאים להיכנע, מה, אנחנו יורים בהם? בשום פנים ואופן לא. בשום פנים ואופן לא. זה לא צה"ל, תקשיבו.
There was a few phrases in there which were quite striking of, we mustn't shoot Gazan civilians. And the requirement of a senior general to remind his soldiers of that, I mean, it happens and soldiers need to be reminded of the care, but it does point to something that's a little bit concerning. The most generous interpretations is scared soldiers misrecognizing threats.
But the IDF points out those threats are sometimes made to look like cries for help.
We have seen attempts by Hamas to use voice recordings of the Hebrew-speaking people, including children, in order to trick the IDF into going into buildings and alleyways in order to be attacked by IEDs.
Now, we don't have any way of verifying if this is true or how often it is true. But it is true that not all Hamas fighters wear uniforms.
Some of the Hamas fighters are dressed in full military regalia, but many are not. Many are fully irregular fighters dressed in civilian clothes.
Once you understand what environment our soldiers are operating in, then you can start understanding why it happened.
So was this, as the IDF describes, just a tragic mistake? We should say the IDF has apologized, but there are many who say enough's enough.
Deal now, they chanted. More than 100 hostages are still being held, and protesters want indirect talks with Hamas to resume.
It's quite obvious the only way to bring hostages alive is by negotiation and by a deal.
Protesters and families of the hostages have repeatedly warned the Israeli government that a ground war would put hostages in harm's way.
The challenge for the IDF, they have stated that they have 2 unequivocal goals. Number 1 is to wipe out Hamas. Number 2 is to rescue and bring home all the hostages. Those two goals are diametrically opposed in terms of the methods required to accomplish both those missions. So therefore, one and or both are being compromised.
The army said, the prime minister said that a military action would lead to the release of the hostages. I never thought that was going to be the case. On the contrary, I think it puts the hostages' lives at risk.
Hamas claims Israeli airstrikes have already killed Israeli hostages hidden in tunnels. And Israel's harshest critics believe this latest incident, the inadvertent killing of 3 Israeli hostages, it is just one more piece of evidence of an excessively violent operation against an enemy the defense minister once branded as human animals. The difference in this case, instead of shooting Hamas, the army shot its own people, those who were desperately trying to save themselves.